Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of the Interface and IIDA Converge Summit. I'm Yasmin Spiro. I am the Director of Content and Strategy at IIDA, and we're so excited to have you all back here today. Thank you, everyone, for being such an engaged part of yesterday's summit. It was an amazing day learning from Catherine Wilkinson and a really incredible group of female climate change activists. We had a really interesting talk with Interface, a virtual tour of their base camp. And thank you so much for all of you who were super engaged and shared so much during our breakout sessions. We're really happy to have you back here with us again today, and we have an exciting lineup. And now for a little bit of housekeeping. Today's session is CEU accredited. This program is registered for 1 CEU. To receive the credit, you must attend the entire webinar, and your credit will be reported within 7 business days. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us at ceu@iida.org. And this morning, I am super excited to kick off day 2 by bringing you a talk and engaging session with Emily Winter. Emily Winter is a weaver and textile artist based in Chicago. She is the co-founder of The Weaving Mill, an experimental weaving studio in Humboldt Park, Westtown in Chicago, that blends design, fine art, textiles, education, and a research-based practice within the context of a repurposed textile manufacturing facility that is co-housed with a day program for adults with developmental disabilities. It's a really fascinating place. I've been sort of following their work for so long, and I'm super excited to have her join us and to share their work with you today. Emily has a master's in textiles from the Rhode Island School of Design and a bachelor's in history from the University of Chicago. And I confess I'm a bit of a fangirl for the Weaving Mill and Emily and all the work that they do. They do really incredible work that is socially engaged and sustainable on multiple levels. And today we're going to start the session by having Emily share just a lot of information on the Weaving Mill, the history of the mill, the programs that they host within the facility. And then we're going to come back together for a short dialogue and then a Q&A at the end. So we'd love for you, as we progress through the session, to share your questions through the Q&A section of the Zoom. And welcome, Emily. We're so excited to have you here with us today.
Hi, Yasmin. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you guys for having me. Yeah, thank you so much to Interface and IIDA and Yasmin for making it all happen, and the wonderful people I just met who are doing the technical and teaching me how to share my screen on Zoom because I'm not so adept at it. Anyway, very glad to be here. Yeah, so as Yasmin said, I am co-founder of the Weaving Mill, which is a multi-headed beast, artist-run industrial studio here in Chicago. We're located in Humboldt Park inside a building called Westtown Center, which is a day program for adults with developmental disabilities run by a social services agency called Envision Unlimited. So as Yasmin said, I'm going to sort of walk through a little bit of the backstory of the mill and the studio and kind of how it came to be, and then talk about some of our main programs that we run and sort of approach to making objects. And hopefully we can all sort of come together for a great conversation. I look forward to hearing your questions and, responses to this story. So the Weaving Mill is really, in many ways, it's sort of like an accident of history of sorts. So we grew out of a company called the Chicago Weaving Corporation, which opened in Chicago in Wicker Park on North Avenue in the 1940s. And they were a commercial weaving operation that made table linens, napkins, tablecloths that were sold in department stores across the Midwest. They moved their facility to Park Ridge on the Northwest side in the 1980s. And by the early 2000s, their business was really dwindling. And this was sort of part of a larger trend, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which was the decline of the domestic textile industry, basically starting in the 70s and moving through till today. And so by the early 2000s, it was pretty difficult for them to survive as a business, as a sort of like mid-scale, product-based textile manufacturer. Well, we'll stay here for a second. So early 2000s, this small sort of local industrial weaving studio was closing down. And the guy who was running the company, Jim, connected with the man from Envision Unlimited, which is the social services agency, with a board member from Envision. And Envision runs these day programs all over Chicago. They do community integrated living arrangements. They have day programs for people with job training capacity and other sorts of program support, life skills, education, all kinds of programs. And so in lieu of completely liquidating their business, Chicago Weaving and Envision decided to partner up with Chicago Weaving, moving some of their equipment into one of Envision's day programs, Westtown Center. And Chicago Weaving would continue doing some of their production of the product lines that they already had developed. And then they would start this job training program for Envision's day program participants, having them learn sort of some of the sewing and packaging and cutting, sort of the finishing work on their products. So they moved in 2005, started that program, brought in some of their old employees. And this sort of new chapter of Chicago Weaving continued for a couple of years, but again, a lot of the same sort of pressures that had forced the business to close its previous chapter, a lot of those pressures remained. And so in the early, like around 2011 or so, the program was really dwindling. And I started working at Westtown Center as a teaching artist in the art studio around that time, around 2011. And I was a hand weaver. I had finished college maybe 2 years before, studying history, and I had started weaving right after graduation as this sort of hard turn away from the academic and towards the manual. And so I went to Westtown Center to work as a teaching artist. And the first time that I went to the building, I immediately was drawn to these industrial textile machines that were along the side of the building. And so Westtown Center is this big single-story brick factory building, very nondescript. A lot of people in the neighborhood are like, we don't know what that is. If any of you guys are in Chicago, we're right along the 606, the Bloomingdale Trail, sort of by the Kimball Art Center. So it's this sort of low-slung, formerly industrial building along the railroad tracks. And so I was working in the building as a teaching artist, working with Envision's clients on hand weaving and sewing and other studio practice. And I was eyeballing this equipment basically from the first time that I went to the program on a job interview. And over the years, I got to know Jim, who was running the program. I got to know, many of Envision's sort of administrative and program people, got to know all the clients in the building. And so a few years later, when Jim was officially retiring from this weaving program, my former boss from Envision got in touch and said, Emily, Jim's retiring. Envision doesn't really have a plan for this equipment. Do you want to make a proposal to do something? And at the time I was getting my master's at RISD in textiles. And, my response was, if I'm being totally honest, it was a pretty even mix of excitement and terror, because it's just a really, my dog Winona has some stuff to say about it. Sorry. Winona, hi. She's very talkative and has many opinions, so pardon. So mix of terror and excitement, obviously. And I was in school with a friend named Maddie Sloman, and she and I started sort of just talking and brainstorming about what we thought could be possible in this studio. And so a big part of that at the beginning was really just trying to understand what was in the space. And so I had this list that Jim had given me of all the equipment. And so I'll just take you on a little bit of a tour here of the studio. So this is the sort of one part of the studio. This is the warping system. This is looking above at the sort of warping system and then the two industrial looms. And so when Maddie and I first got started, which was the summer of 2015, a lot of what we were doing was trying to sort of take stock of what was in the space. And so we were cleaning up, we were organizing equipment, organizing material, working with Jim to figure out is this loom part a really essential thing to hold on to, or is this come from a loom that was scrapped 20 years ago and there's no reason to keep this, oddly shaped hunk of metal? Some of those questions remain unanswered, and I'm sort of constantly encountering things where I'm like, is this important to keep or should we throw it away? It's a constant struggle. So as we sort of began the process of evaluating sort of what was in the space, it was kind of a two-part thing of both, like on this really sort of literal material level, like what's here? Does this sewing machine work? Does this part belong to anything? Where do we put the yarn, et cetera? There was also kind of this sort of other level process by which we were doing that, of kind of figuring out, well, how do these things work together? And then how do we relate to the program, the day programs at Westtown Center, in a way that feels sort of meaningful and challenging and sort of integrative with the studio practice that we're trying to build? What's the studio practice that we're trying to build? What do we want to make? Where do we sit in the sort of like textile manufacturing landscape? And the weaving mill is a really, it's a funny space. I'll just go back to this slide for a second, because on the one hand, it's an enormous space. And I always sort of joke that like the weaving mill has like extreme body dysmorphia or studio size dysmorphia or something, because it's like, it is a huge space, and there's a lot of physical space. The equipment's really large. There are a lot of moving, literal and figurative moving parts, but it's also tiny. Like the machines that we're running are industrial, but we have 2 industrial looms. And so, you know, for comparison, like a sort of a comrade mill, the Oriole mill, which is in Hendersonville, North Carolina, which is a small scale industrial sort of artisan weaving studio producer, they have, I think, 15 industrial jacquards. And so 15 sort of in the more conventional industrial textile manufacturing landscape is really small. And then interface, I'm sure you guys are working with mills that have hundreds and hundreds of looms on the weaving room floor. So we have two. They're both incredibly different from each other. Like there's these ways in which the weaving mill is this funny hybrid of kind of the handmade and the industrial, because we have sort of the power of industry in terms of some of the technology, but we don't have the volume necessarily that would sort of warrant like large scale production or even make large scale production possible. So there's like, I think that's for me one of the things that's most exciting about this project in the studio, is that tension between the hand and the industrial, and kind of that I think drives a lot of how we think about design and production at the studio. So now we've seen a little bit of the weaving mill. This is our sort of, you know, just the extended part of the studio: fabric storage, sewing machines, cutting table, hand looms, etc. This is the creel. And now I'm going to sort of take you just on a really actually very literal tour through the manufacturing process at the mill, because it's fun and it's interesting. And I also do think it's a really lovely sort of laboratory for understanding the way that woven fabrics are made. And I think, you know, obviously you guys are all interiors people, so I'm sure you have some language of this, and maybe some of you are weavers or have been in weaving studios, but regardless, I think it's just a fun tour. So this is the creel. So we do what's called sectional warping, meaning we wind warps, or the warps on the loom go on in sort of 6-inch sections. And the warping system is really, for me, the most exciting part of the studio, because in, you know, woven fabric, we have the warp and the weft, and sort of in conventionally in larger scale manufacturing, the warps are often preset and they're solid, or the stripes are sort of more engineered or standardized. And oftentimes in a lot of weaving, it's in the structure and the weft color and material choice that the fabric really comes to life. And so for us at the weaving mill, because of the particular sort of ecosystem of equipment that we have, the warp is a huge part of the design process. And so working with this creel, which is sort of seems maybe, you know, unassuming, is actually kind of like, it's like one of the major determining factors of the way that we design. And just like the number of threads that we're working with and the number of threads per section. So the warping system, basically the creel, all these yarns are coming off of the creel. They're coming through, this is called a cross maker, or that's what I call it. I'm not sure what the sort of a rigid heddle cross maker to keep the sequence of the threads all organized. And then we're winding section by section. So these are 6.5-inch sections of threads that we're winding. And this pin warper, which is what is getting wound with the threads, is essentially a giant measuring wheel. So the circumference of the thing is 4 yards all around, and the threads are wrapping and wrapping and wrapping however many rotations to get the length of warp that we're looking for. And I'm going to show just a little video. I'm going to warn you, it's really squeaky, but you're getting like the full weaving mill experience, which is like painfully squeaky warping. Oh, you're not getting the sound. How exciting. Okay, great. Well, better for your ears. So the warping process is basically looking like this. All these yarns are peeling off that creel and wrapping around the pin warper. And then the resulting sort of moment in the process is this, where we have all these sections and all these lovely little heads of knots coming through. And this is a sort of wound warp that's ready for transfer. And then the next step in the process is to get the warp off of this pin warper and transfer it onto the beam so that it can go on the loom. And so this beam, the transfer process, I think, is just like one of the most beautiful moments of the whole process. So what's happening is all of those sections have been attached to this metal beam here, and this beam is on a back winder, and it's just peeling all these threads off and wrapping them around the beam. And here's another one just for good measure. And so once that beam is wound, it is then trucked over. I realized I think I got so excited about the details. I maybe haven't shared enough sort of images to give you context. So hopefully you're holding with me here. But the beam itself is now going to come over to the loom, and then we're going to tie it in. And so all of our warps get tied in by hand. So when you're dressing the loom, the warp threads are what get threaded onto the loom. And on most commercial looms and our looms, the loom is never undressed. So every warp that's on the loom, when it is finished, the next warp just gets tied onto it and then pulled through the whole system of the loom. And so this is a photograph of setting up the rack. So it's a sort of tension, it's called the knot rack. And it allows us to tension those two warps together really evenly and clamp them into place so that we can cut and tie each individual thread. And so this on the right is a picture of Kendall, who is the weaving mill production assistant and studio person extraordinaire, and sort of de facto weaving mill hand model, tying some knots. So we do, typically one would use a automated knot tying machine, which we have, but ours doesn't work. And so we do it by hand. And so that's another one of those things where it's kind of like, I think a lot of the tension and kind of like core of the weaving mill is taking these, there are certain sort of assumptions or expectations that one has kind of as soon as you enter the realm of the industrial, like about efficiency and about how things ought to be done in the most sort of like, usually efficiency is usually kind of the driving motivator, because, the less time something takes, the less expensive it is generally. And in the weaving mill, we really have to throw a lot of those things out. And that for me has been a big learning curve over the last couple of years, of sort of learning to understand when, or just to kind of revalue the way that we think about sort of time and cost, and sort of figuring out sort of what elements or what techniques really are the best for that particular moment. And so for us, hand tying, although it may take 8-ish hours to tie a warp in, as opposed to the maybe 2 hours it would take with a functioning knot tying machine, probably less than that, honestly, maybe an hour and a half, I don't know, but our knot tying machine is really busted. So anyway, so that sort of thinking about kind of well, this is how it has to work here. And so then we sort of figure out ways to sort of make that make sense in the ecosystem of our production. And then this is looking at the back of the loom, and you can see on the bottom there we have the new warp, which is this sort of lighter black and white stripe, and then it's tied into that old warp, which is the bolder black and white stripe. So each individual warp end is tied old to new, old to new. And so on the warp itself, we have about 1,600 warp ends. So 1600 knots to get that tied in each time we change out the warp. And this is a fun little video showing you the pulling through of the warps. So that's all the knots, warp 1 to warp 2, drawing them all through as they come through the loom. This is one of the most fun and exciting moments in the loom dressing process. And then once the loom is dressed, the looms that we're working on are, as I said, industrial production looms. They're both Dobby looms. So we work on 16 harness Dobby looms, and they're Italian, Summit and ITEMA. And this loom, which I'll show you this little production video, is really kind of like the core workhorse of the studio. It is a 2005 loom. We can program new structures and constructions on there, whereas the other loom is punch card powered, so it's a little bit more limited. And a lot of the fabrics that we're making are really very much about material and color and really simple kind of plays of construction, striping, material combination, because we're working, as I said, with Dobby looms. And so we can't necessarily, as I'm sure you guys are all familiar, like on a jacquard loom, you can work in a larger non-repeating graphic. You can have a repeating graphic, but you can sort of play with the representational qualities a little bit more. Whereas in Dobby weaving, it really is a much smaller scale of a repeat. And so it really becomes about sort of playing with texture and construction. And so it's kind of like the weaver's loom in a way. And in some ways they're not very sexy because, it's like a lot of what we end up doing is plain weave. But I mean, just because plain weave is so versatile and wonderful, like this is a plain weave fabric here. But just by sort of combining, by really taking really simple elements and playing with them, we can create really diverse fabrics that have really, really special like material feeling. And again, this is like this sort of ongoing theme of the weaving mill. Like we're really nesting in this place between the handmade and the industrial. And so I don't think I have any photos of it, but all of our fabrics start on a hand loom. So we have a smaller hand-powered Dobby loom that I keep set up in this with the same parameters as the production loom. So everything generally starts on that loom. So I'll weave narrow swatch, 8-inch swatches, set them up with the same materials, and then play with constructions on the hand loom of different, material combinations, different densities, whatever it is. And so it's really like, this is very much a start to finish, sort of process at the weaving mill studio. And that for me as a designer and a maker is a really big, it's an important part of just the practice of the studio. When I was in grad school, part of those conversations that Maddie, my co-founder, and I were having we were in the textiles MFA program at RISD, and we were seeing a lot of our classmates and peers go on to these jobs in the textile industry, which were amazing and challenging and wonderful. But from my perspective, they felt very divorced from the process of making. And so there might be a loom in the studio, in the design studio, but it didn't really seem like there was such a strong connection between the work that one might do on the loom as a designer, experimental work, sort of exploratory work, to the sort of active production. And so for me, my interest is really in kind of bringing all of these elements together in one place. And so the weaving mill is like this wonderful, obviously, opportunity to try to house all of these sort of moments of the design process under one roof and have them be really integrated and have kind of the production parameters determine the way that you start the design. And so a lot of the ethos of the weaving mill is really about responding to the available materials, responding to the available equipment, and really not about, I think about when we were first starting the studio, even before when I was in grad school, I met with a friend of mine named Philip, who was he had been the tech like the sort of weaving tech in the textiles department, and then had worked at a number of different mills around the country. And he's like a total mechanical textile loom genius, and has, the part of the challenge of this whole thing is that a lot of the knowledge of the textile industry has really died off in the last 10, 15 years. And as the industry itself is shrinking, a lot of that institutional knowledge is disappearing, of parts, repair, even just like names of machines. And it's a small and tight knit sort of community, but it's also quite dispersed, and it's also not very well documented, so it's a lot of like word of mouth kind of thing, where it's like you find somebody and then you ask them, oh, do you know where to get this thing? And they say, oh yeah, I think I know this guy in Maine, call him and maybe he knows where to get this, But anyway, so Philip and I were talking, I was showing him photos of the shop and the list of equipment, and Philip was kind of like, Emily, this stuff's like not that great, like that loom's going to cause you trouble because of this, you're not going to be able to get parts for this, like you're going to have problems with your warping because you don't have good tension on the thing. He was kind of like, this is going to be more trouble than it's worth. And I understand where he was coming from, because he was coming from he was coming from a more, like, I'll just say it, sort of like running a proper business, kind of textile mill background, and really trying to sort of understand a studio that would function really smoothly. And I have to say, I'm like so glad that I wasn't deterred by his words of warning, because so much of the strength of the studio and the things that we make has really come out of identifying the limitations and the shortcomings of these things, the space, what's possible in it, and trying to figure out ways of making those limitations into strengths. And so I think that is sort of to bring it to this idea about sustainability and sort of how we think about the ways that we make things. I think that a lot of the ethos of the weaving mill is very much about working with what's available, working with what's around you, finding relationships between different systems and materials that can sort of bring out the best in those elements and those materials and that equipment, and then sort of taking that to the next level, thinking about taking that approach and applying it to sort of social practice type things and interpersonal things. And the idea of the weaving mill really being about building systems that are sustainable in the sense of, not necessarily in the sense of like carbon footprint, because I don't think that that's the area where we have the power to make impact because of the scale that we're working, but sustainable in the sense of that they feed the people who are a part of them, these systems, and don't deplete, but rather, feed and sort of encourage growth. So that's my tangent sort of about ethos of the weaving mill. And that's a really good segue to talking about the programs at the studio. So the W.A.R.P program is the Westtown Education for Textiles. And so this is really the arena through which we work with Envision Unlimited. So when we started, we really wanted to rethink the whole job training program and refocus our efforts on a more holistic textile education program. So instead of sort of focusing on teaching people how to cut and fringe products so that they could get sent out and sold, it was really about trying to like sort of encourage people to relate to textiles as full designers, as artists, and to take a sort of ownership practice in the act of making and in relation to the textiles. So this is a sort of fun shot of a bunch of the W.A.R.P crew investigating doing a little on-loom critique of a rug that we were working on a few months ago. This is Lucy from the program just reopened about a month ago. So we've just started back with weaving classes. And so a lot of what we do in the program is sort of a collaborative open studio model with people working on shared warps on these floor looms, designing and making both products for sale. So we've been working on tote bags for the last while, which have been hugely popular and are very fun. So this is Yolanda standing next to a batch of freshly cut off the loom tote bags. These are the finished tote bags. And so we use a lot of recycled, donated, dead stock, scrapped, tied together materials. You'll notice here, if you look at Lucy's shuttle and then also the fabric on the loom, all the variegation in the fabric. So it's almost getting at kind of like a faux ikat effect. This is from just tying together scraps of yarn. So we don't throw anything away. We just have a huge pile of yarn scraps from the loom dressing process. Just basically anytime there's a short piece of yarn, it goes in this basket. And then in class, people will hang out at the table and just tie, tie bits together and then wrap them around the shuttles. And that's a practice that William Claiborne, who's one of the core weavers in the program, started doing, just kind of as a sort of expression of, you know, he's got that sort of don't throw anything away ethos. So he was like, we gotta tie this yarn together. It's like, yes, this looks so great. It's beautiful. So it really, all of the tote bags are totally one of a kind, very unique. And part of the sort of design ethos of this program is that there's certain kind of design rules that we sort of set up. But that at every sort of moment in the process, there's an opportunity for choice. So people can, you know, think about, well, what colors do we want in the warp? Or, you know, what color handle am I going to put in the bag? Or I just finished weaving with this yarn. What's the next yarn that's going to go next to it? And so there's all these little micro opportunities for choice. But because of kind of the overarching, you know, sort of design rules, I'll call them, like we end up with a really cohesive aesthetic. And so the tote bags have been a huge hit, which we've been selling for the last 2 years or so. And we do a 60% split to the weavers based on their participation, and then a 40% split to the program budget to cover materials and facilitators and et cetera. So the other project that we've been doing also kind of on this like sort of, you know, closed loop kind of production cycle is the weaving process on the industrial looms. You'll see on the left here, the video, our looms are called selvage looms. And so they create these cut selvages as part of the weaving process. And so this is kind of a scrap material. So certainly it isn't. So we save that and wrap it into these lovely balls. And then we use it as weft yarn in these rugs that we've started producing in the last year or so. So these are another just really amazingly fun product that we've been working on in the weft class. And here are a couple glamour shots of some recent rugs. And then we've started working on placemats also, which are another just really fun project to do. And so what sort of has ended up happening is that in the weft studio, we have, you know, this handful of floral looms, and each one kind of has a specific type of project, and the loom, the style of weaving that's happening on all of them is really different. And so all of the participants in the program have an opportunity to really build dexterity on different types of weaving, different types of looms. And it's really, I mean, we've been really focusing pretty exclusively on the hand weaving for the last like 3 years. And it's really, I'm so proud of everybody. Like the skills have increased like exponentially, people's confidence. And also, you know, it's obviously really gratifying to earn a paycheck for something. It's like, I always remember like the first time somebody bought something that I made, and it was like such a high, you know, it like feels great. And so it's really exciting to be able to sort of support or facilitate that experience for the weft crew. And so in addition to making the products in the class, we also, again, really try to encourage people to sort of engage as full designers. And so we do these workshops, design workshops. This was a really fun stripe analysis and stripe design class that we did a couple months ago. So looking at examples of existing fabrics, looking at research books, making drawings, thinking about different color combinations. This was a similar sort of drawing workshop, playing with plaids. And then this was another element of taking stripe drawings and then translating them into warp wrappings. And then these warp wrappings we then used to design warps for the class to weave on. And then we also have been trying to incorporate, again, more sort of like that whole holistic educational component. This is a couple of photos from a field trip we took last January to the Art Institute here in Chicago to see the Weaving Beyond the Bauhaus exhibition, which was like, again, really, really fun and just so great to see people, you know, finding sort of rhythms or not rhythms, finding rhymes or mirrors between the work that they were seeing in the show and the work that we do in the studio. And so then another main element of the weaving mill practice is the Westtown Artist Residency Project, which is an annual residency program that we host usually in the summer. And so from 2016 to 19, it was an in-person residency where we had visiting artists come and host workshops and work on their own studio work. And then this year, we obviously had to restructure the program due to the coronavirus. And we sort of turned it into this remote materials-based residency. Earlier this year, I was contacted by a store here in Chicago who had a pallet of this unprocessed cotton yarn, or cotton fluff, excuse me, that they had gotten for a store build out demonstration thing, and they were trying to get rid of it. And so they said, do you want it? We said, yes, of course. And so we ended up with this 500 pounds of cotton fluff and decided to use that as the material of the residency. So over the course of the spring, people were requesting boxes of cotton fluff from the weaving mill. We'd send it out to them with this little instructional packet. And then the prompt of the residency was essentially sort of do what you will with it. And then, you know, be in touch in a few months and let us know what happened. And so we've started getting some of the responses back, and it's fabulous. So these are just a couple works that have come back, sort of how different people have processed the cotton. So again, another sort of element of that, you know, there's no waste, everything is sort of repurposable, but then also kind of that idea of like dispersing into the world and then recollecting is, I think, a big part of how I think about what we do at the weaving mill. Weaving mill projects, we do a lot of different things. We just launched our first in-print newsletter, which is really fun, which you can subscribe to on our website if you're interested. And so this is just trying to find ways of communicating sort of the breadth and depth of the studio in a way that can sometimes, I find, limiting online. So we're now doing a print newsletter, which is coming out quarterly. And we did the first one in August, and it was a real blast. So we're going to continue. We're also working on a print mail order catalog right now to send out this year. And so this sort of brings us to the weaving mill products, which are the things that we design and make in the studio under the weaving mill sort of label. And a lot of these things, as you might imagine, are focused on using dead stock and recycled yarns. And also sort of in addition to the dead stock and recycled, we've been getting more into apparel design, which has been really fabulous, sort of branch out from the home goods territory. We have a dye garden at the studio where we are growing natural dye plants and then developing a seed library program where we're saving seeds and then sending them out to folks who want to grow their own natural dyes. So we've been growing indigo, marigolds, Hopi black sunflowers, coreopsis, and golden marguerite, and we'll continue expanding that program hopefully next year. This is Kendall and I doing some fresh leaf indigo harvesting, and this is some silk fabric freshly dyed with fresh leaf indigo, drying on the indigo plants. And then another aspect of the studio work for me is thinking about not only those sort of dead stock scrapped materials, but also thinking about like, how do we work with contemporary materials and engage with contemporary supply chains in meaningful ways? So I've been working on this project for the last year and a half or so, tracing wool that's raised in the Navajo Nation through its various stages of processing. And this is wool that a friend of mine in Chicago he's sort of a wool broker and wool producer. He produces yarns that we make products with. So this sort of more research-based practice is also a big part of what the weaving mill is about. And then collaboration. So we do design and production with other artists and designers of all different stripes. This was a project that I did with Nellie Agassi a year and a half ago, doing an installation at the Graham Foundation here in Chicago. So this was Nellie's, had this beautiful exhibition. And I think she, if I recall correctly, she had a dream one night about these curtains and then got in touch with me and said, can we make these curtains? And it was a really beautiful collaboration. It was really an instance of, you know, she had this idea about what she wanted to have happen. And then through the process of working together, obviously that idea sort of had to shape to the parameters of what's possible on our looms. And so there were just a lot of different iterations, and it really became about kind of distilling the core essence of what she was looking for, and then figuring out how to articulate that with the technology and the materials that are available at the mill. This was another installation that we contributed to at the Graham Foundation, which was the Tatiana Bilbao studio, Unraveling Modern Living, which was a year and a half ago also, I guess. And so we contributed these sort of multi-purpose sitting mat pillows that were a part of this installation, which was a really lovely thing to be a part of as well. And then this is another recent project, a collaboration with a choreographer and dancer artist here in Chicago, Martine Whitehead, building these or constructing these large woven panels that were part of an installation that was part of the architecture biennial last year. And then on the more sort of product-oriented side, we have recent collaboration with a bag designer here in Chicago, 1733, where we produced the fabric and Phil made these amazing bags. And then we have an ongoing collaboration with Jamie Hayes of Production Mode, who is a apparel designer here in Chicago. And so this is just one recent project that we've done together. Whew, okay, thanks for listening. I think that I'm going to conclude there with the presentation. Hi, Yasmin.
Hi, Emily. That was amazing. I kind of want to watch those videos over and over again of the mills in action.
Yes.
They're so fun and like weirdly meditative. They're really great.
Yeah.
No, I really love the ethos of the weaving mill and your holistic approach to sustainability. It's so much about the people that are involved in your practice, and you can really see it in the pictures how engaged the adults from the learning programs are. It's really great, and I imagine it must be really satisfying for you to see the weaving mill have developed this way. We have a bunch of questions from the audience. I'm just going to ask a couple personal questions before I start. So I told Emily, I'm the director of content, but I'm also an artist and a practicing artist. And I think what's really interesting as a creative person is to see someone pursue their passion and to sort of exist with this sort of multiplicity of creative outlets, and how you and the weaving mill and your collaborators are constantly evolving. And I think that kind of ties into one of the questions that was shared, that is, how has the facility or your idea of the weaving mill changed since you initially opened? And I also just wanted to add on to that, like you personally, could you have imagined the weaving mill being what it is today when you first were like eyeing those like big mills, the big looms in the back of the factory?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. You know, I think that it's kind of like yes and no, you know, not, it's like or in terms of the, like, could I imagine it be like, the thing that I think feels really wonderful about the evolution of the weaving mill is that like everything feels kind of like right, you know, or like, and in the sense that like when Maddie and I first started having these brainstorming conversations, you know, 6 years ago, we kind of established what at the time we called them the spokes. We were like, okay, here's the main elements of what we can see happening in this studio. Right. And well, of course, those have the sort of, you know, the shade of those have changed over the years, just over the course of working and reality and whatever, like the essence of them hasn't changed. And so it feels like there's kind of this sort of true north of the studio, you know, that hasn't changed, which feels really good and is very grounding. And okay, so, oh, and how has it changed? I think that a big part of it when we first started, you know, Maddie and I ran the studio for 3 years together, and then she moved on about 2 years ago. But when we first started, we were really focused on doing design and production for other companies and designers, which is a whole arena of stuff that I didn't show you because it's, you know, a couple of years old and whatever. But we did a lot of design, you know, with smaller scale, both interiors and apparel kind of people producing yardage. And I think that when we started, we really were thinking of ourselves as kind of occupying this place in the textile production landscape where we could do really kind of bespoke artisanal yardage.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a great learning experience, and it was really fun, and also incredibly challenging, and
Yeah.
definitely got a lot of information. And I think that the main thing that's happened, and I think just to say it really plainly, like I think my confidence as a designer has increased a lot in the last couple of years, and kind of sort of coming to terms with in a funny way, coming to terms with the fact that like I really do want to make my own work, you know, and I want to work with other people and facilitate other people's work, but like sort of figuring out what the output of the weaving mill is on its own terms has been, I think, that's been growing in terms of what we do, and that's really exciting and fun, to kind of try to put that step forward with that foot, as opposed to the foot of we sort of do whatever you want, you know?
Yeah, I think, I think as a creative, that's always a challenge of like, how do you balance the things you do, whether it's teaching or working in a creative setting or for an amazing association, how do you balance those things and maintain your practice and engage with other people? And, so much of it is about, going out into the world and engaging with other people, and that feeds back into your practice as well. I wanted to ask you a great question from the list. So Alvin is asking, did you always imagine that you would end up running your own studio while at RISD? And as a designer, it's amazing that you're teaching these techniques to adults with developmental disabilities. Do you have stories you can share of working with them?
I think, yeah. I mean, in terms of like whether I thought I would be running, I think that I've just personally, like I like working for myself, and I'm, kind of bossy, so I think that
confidence.
Yeah. Right. Know how I like things done. But I think that, when I was in school, as I mentioned, I felt this disconnect between what I was kind of seeing of what was available basically in terms of jobs, and what I wanted. And I'm so like, this is the weaving mill is like this. I feel, as a non-religious person, like feel blessed to have, like, it just feels like this amazing, just like series of life accidents, where I'm like, I can't believe I met this person, and she was so generous, and she became such a good friend. But then she also, really opened the door to Envision for me. And, through just like, there's a lot of just that's, I think of it sort of as the series of dominoes, but it's, I think, I remember, a couple years ago going to hear Sheila Hicks give a talk in Boston. She's like in her 80s, and she's so inspiring and amazing. But at the end, somebody asked like, do you have any advice to young designers or something? And she was really cute. She's like, pick up the phone. She's like, just call, if you want to do something, just call someone and ask them if you can do it. And I thought that was such good advice. And also kind of just this idea of like, it's like, go see what's behind that door, and like, maybe there's something cool, yeah. And then as far as sort of stories about working with the W.A.R.P participants, I mean, tons of stories. I think that, that's really, in a way, because of, there's a way in which that program is kind of, it's like the core of the weaving mill in a lot of ways, because the partnership with Envision is the reason the weaving mill exists, and there's, I can't really imagine a scenario in which the weaving mill could make sense outside of that partnership. It's very much grown out of that partnership. And yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's like, there's, the population at Westtown Center is really consistent. Like, people have been coming there. There's people who I've known, I've been involved with the building for about 10 years, and there's people who've been there for 5 years before I ever got there. And so it's like this really steady community that is really, I'm very glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, I think what's really clear is from listening to you and kind of listening to your history of the progression of the mill is just you sort of following your intuition, like making choices that felt right to you, which I think is really important. And I think good for all designers and artists to see and hear, that you can do that and find spaces and places to explore your creativity in that way. We have another really great question that is sort of existential. From Caleb, the weaving mill seems to sit in a very unconventional intersection. I imagine it's a constantly evolving mentality, but how have you maintained your confidence, self-efficacy, and your vision when the technology isn't working, others continue to naysay, and the world seems stacked up against it?
That's a great question. I get really frustrated. Like I have this terrible, like one of my most shameful moments was a couple years ago. I was like really something like tech, like a loom wasn't working, something wasn't working. And I was so mad. I just like took this pair of scissors and like slammed them on, like broke this pair of scissors on it. And I remember Maddie was there. She was just like, what is wrong with you? And I was like, ah, I really took it out on these scissors. Not very mature of me, but better than taking it out on something else. But it's very frustrating. I mean, I don't know. It's really frustrating. And like the technical stuff is all like last year, actually with those Nellie Agassi panels that I showed you, that was a very big, very, very big project for me. And about a month-ish before I was set to produce those, like we designed all the samples, materials were ordered, ready to produce, the loom died.
Oh,
like it just died. It completely died. And it was, terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. And I found recently a piece of paper that I had been writing some notes on at the time. And it was really like, I just was like writing out all the possible scenarios. And it was like, okay, one scenario is that, we get this replacement circuit board and the loom starts working and we can produce the things and it was just sort of like trying to sort of think through all these different scenarios. But then I was really pleased, I was like thinking about it. And like in that moment, like I was able to reach out to at least 3 different mills / like commercial weavers who I had met a couple years previously. Maddie and I took this big sort of research trip visiting different textile studios and mills around the country, and was able to just like talk to these 3 different, in this case, all women who ran or were designers at different mills. And I was sort of like buoyed by the fact that in the process, like in this moment when the loom was dead, I was like, oh my God, am I going to be able to produce this commission? Am I going to have to hand weave this thing? That's impossible. Like, that these 3 different mills were all to some extent like available to help me troubleshoot this, and it was like, MTL was like, we can probably produce it. Like we can do, we'll have to tweak it in this way, but I think we could do it. And then Beth Ann at Oriole is like, I can't do it, but ask this, but there was a web and a community that was there to support it. But so that's part of it, I think. And that's, in terms of like sort of keeping the confidence of the mill going, I feel very lucky. I think that people really respond to something of the weaving mill and are very supportive of it, which is really like mind-blowing to me and makes me like teary-eyed and happy, but like when we launched this newsletter, I was like, this is kind of a goofy project, but like it seems fun and like let's do it, and the response has been really extraordinary, and people are like doing paid subscriptions and are being very generous with it. And it's like sort of recognizing that there's, I think, beyond the objects that we make, which I think stand on their own merit, there's something that people are responding to and excited about supporting kind of in the model of the mill, which is like, that's, yeah, sometimes it feels very lonely and frustrating in there, but also like I totally have not really mentioned Kendall and Alexa, Kendall's been working with the mill for the last 3 years. Alexa's been a little like a year and a half. And they're both incredibly skilled. Alexa's a fashion designer and pattern maker and sewer, and Kendall's a weaver, an artist and designer, and their skills and their sense of calm and their expertise are really grounding and sort of keep the studio healthy.
Yeah, it's great to have good collaborators around you, because I imagine, it looks beautiful and the story's amazing, but we all know projects like this are a lot of hard work, lots of organization, lots of decision making. So it's good to have a great team. I know that's at IIDA because that's how we make all these things happen, with all the people behind the scenes and all the people involved. It really is always like a big team effort. I think what's one of the really nice things about the mill, relating back to what you were just saying about people, the way people are responding to it, is it feels like a really open place. It feels really inviting, and it feels very experimental. So it feels like ideas won't be judged and you can come there and explore an idea. I saw that show, the Nellie Agassi show at the Graham, and those pieces were really, they were incredible. So I think we have 3 more minutes. If there are no more questions from the audience, I'm going to ask you to share a little bit more, just really quickly, maybe just 1 or 2 minutes about the Navajo project that you touched on at the end, but I think it's a really interesting story of sustainability in a way that's very different than we have been sort of discussing through this program. Could you share just a little bit more about that and your particular interest in that?
Yeah. So I've been, as I said, this friend of mine produces wool that he is purchasing raw wool from the Navajo Nation. And so he's been part of this wool buy, which happens every June, where commercial wool buyers are going to the Navajo Nation, which is in the Arizona, New Mexico, sort of Four Corners area, and purchasing raw wool from Navajo producers. And it's this wool buy has been happening for about 10 years, and it kind of has created better market opportunities for Navajo producers, because previously they didn't have really great opportunities for selling the wool that they were raising. And so my interest in it, as somebody who weaves with material that's like related to that supply chain through this friend of mine who produces the wool, my interest has become really about sort of, on one level, kind of illuminating or documenting the supply chain itself, like what actually happens, like what does it mean to buy wool commercially? Where does it go? How does it get packed? Like how does it get sorted? Who are the people involved? And then sort of thinking about that in relation to the objects that we make. We've been producing blankets and scarves and other woolen items with this stuff, but like, how can you sort of talk about that sort of supply chain, without kind of falling into the traps of like the transparency, traceability, kind of like marketing rhetoric? And how do you do it in a way that's like actually really meaningful and also kind of like brings to life the whole, like the histories and the pathways that materials follow as they come into object form. So yeah, that's.
Thank you. I mean, I can see the through line from your history undergrad to your. Definitely. Thank you so much, Emily. That was fascinating. And, I learned a lot from it, and I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. I know that you have a full day. Emily is going on to do a presentation for the Textile Society of Americas, correct?
Yeah.
You're going to be sharing the Navajo story today. Awesome. Thank you again so much. And thank you to Interface for supporting this program.